Now, oil prices got some much-needed relief today, right? Rebounding from the lowest level in more than 12 years. There's been speculation that OPEC countries might agree to production cuts with non-members, but according to the IEA, the likelihood of that happening is very low. Joining us now from Houston is Djerejian, former U.S. ambassador to Syria and Israel, also the former chairman of Occidental Petroleum. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today. You know, before I get to what's going on in the oil markets, though, given your background as in your work in Syria, I've got to ask you what you make of this truce between Syria and the U.S., Russia, and others.
Well, Betty, you know, this Syria is a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions, and what has happened in the last week is a very slight glimmer of hope that the international community and the parties on the ground in Syria may be gravitating towards some sort of what I would call a truce leading to a ceasefire of the various parties. It's not a done deal. There are very conflicting agendas. The Russians, the Iranians, the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, the United States, the Europeans, the Saudis, the Qataris. There are many different voices involved. However, the good news is that they seem to be groping toward a temporary truce, I would call it, that might lead to a ceasefire. If that's accomplished, then this Geneva III initiative may proceed, where the opposing parties begin to sit around a rather large table involving the U.S., Russia, France, Britain, the Syrian regime, the Iranians. So we'll have to see. It's still very problematic.
Well, should the president be leaning harder on Russia?
Oh, I believe so, yes. I think Putin is playing a relatively weak hand very skillfully, so skillfully that Russia has become virtually the power broker of what happens on the ground in Syria today. And basically will have a amplified voice in these Geneva III discussions. But I think the United States really has to step up on a plate and use our influence in a very intelligent way, but really to put it to the Russians that their air campaign is causing untold damage and humanitarian casualties and forcing political issues.
Hundreds of thousands is the estimate, almost 500,000 lives lost in Syria from the war. I want to switch, though, to the oil markets now, and this comeback we've seen today, almost 11% gain in oil prices. I mean, what magically has changed in the last 24 hours to make these prices jump up? What do you think of that?
Well, if you watch the oil market, it's like looking at an EKG.
And it does give you a heart attack. It could. Yes.
It does. And anyone holding energy stocks is you have to have an ironclad stomach to go through this. But look, I just came back from a trip from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and talked with some key energy producers and people involved in the industry, in the sector. And it's my hunch that Saudi Arabia especially and the Gulf countries, they're gonna keep to maintaining their market share, especially in Asia. And even though they're getting more lobbying, as you've indicated in your reports, from other OPEC members to perhaps try to control the price of oil so that it doesn't continue its steep decline and can stabilize at a better level. But I think what we're going to see, the prognosis I came away with, the bottom line was that the OPEC, and especially Saudi Arabia, they're going to continue to their policy of market share, but that they foresee some readjustment in the oil demand and supply equation toward the end of this year, and certainly in 2017, where there'll be some readjustment, and we're going to begin to see increases in the price of oil. We're not going to see $80, $85, $100 oil, but we're looking, the prognoses are $50, $60 oil, perhaps. Now, I'm not prophesizing this, but this is what I'm telling you is the assessment I come back with.
And is this based, what is this based on, though? Is it based on just the inventory situation? Is it based on somebody cutting first? I mean, what would this be based on?
Well, I think they're taking the long view, like anyone looking at this. They're looking at the fundamentals of supply and demand in countries like India and China and Asia. They're looking at what the low price of oil has done to the North American shale producers, especially. That, you know, some companies are going to go out of business, and there may be some production or some supply limitations there. It's not sure because a lot of these shale companies have to keep on producing to pay their debts.
Right.
But still, what we're seeing is, I think that in a global context, what they're beginning to see is some limitations on production that will be equated with some increases in demand as we go into end of 2016 and 17, and that's the estimate of perhaps some not reconciliation, but readjustment of supply and demand for a higher price of oil around the $50, $60 level.
All right. Thank you. We're going to leave it here, but thank you so much for joining me. Really, really appreciate it. That was Edward Djerejian, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria and Israel, also former chairman of Occidental Petroleum.